Deepening the pain, China is Canada's second biggest seafood customer, second only to the United States.
President Donald Trump just said the U.S. has not necessarily been focused on this country and trade also.
Imagine this. A billion-dollar war is raging across the Atlantic. Not with missiles, not with tanks, but with lobsters. Yes, lobsters. Those red-clawed creatures sitting on ice at your local supermarket are now pawns in one of the most brutal trade battles of our time. Families in Maine are watching centuries of tradition collapse overnight, while Canadian fishermen are cashing in like never before. This isn't just seafood, it's survival, politics, and pride, all tangled in a net of global trade deals. And by the end of this story, you'll see how a creature that can't even scream out loud has managed to divide allies, topple industries, and spark outrage on both sides of the border. China is Canada's second biggest seafood customer, right after the United States. And here's the shocking twist. It's not steel, not oil, but lobsters that have become the weapon of choice in this billion-dollar trade war.
Not steel or oil, but lobsters have become the weapon in a billion-dollar trade war, with Canada cashing in on premium deals.
Canada is striking premium deals, while U.S. shipments, once the crown jewel of global seafood, are left rotting on the docks. How did America lose its grip on the very waters that once defined it? Well, while U.S. exporters were struggling, Canadians were celebrating. In the first half of 2019 alone, Canada sent 40% more lobsters to China than the year before. A gold rush was on, and the Americans were left empty-handed. The real turning point came when Canada secured the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA, with the European Union. That single deal flipped the entire lobster market upside down. Before CETA, Canadian and American lobsters competed on equal footing in Europe. But when the ink dried on that agreement, Canadian lobsters sailed into Europe tariff-free. Meanwhile, Maine lobsters were slapped with tariffs of up to 8%.
Loving all of this, the Canadians. They have sent 40% more lobsters to China in the first half of 2019.
Now, 8% might not sound like much. But when French restaurants or German wholesalers are buying thousands of pounds of lobster, that difference decides everything. It's the margin between a deal and a pass. And the result? Overnight, European buyers shifted to Canada. Not because Nova Scotia lobsters were tastier, not because Prince Edward Island lobsters were bigger, but because they were cheaper. Tariffs turned into Canada's secret weapon, and the U.S. couldn't compete. For Canadian fishermen, it was like winning the lottery. Generations of families who had braved freezing Atlantic waters suddenly saw their catches commanding premium prices. Lobster pounds overflowed, exporters inked deals across Europe, and coastal towns in Atlantic Canada thrived like never before. But across the border in Maine, the mood couldn't have been darker. Their market share evaporated almost overnight. The same European restaurants that once proudly advertised Maine lobster on menus replaced it with homard Canadian. And this wasn't just about business, it was personal. Maine lobstermen felt betrayed. To them, Canada hadn't won through better fishing, but through clever politics.
Seafood companies on the East Coast are really laser focused now at trying to find other customers for their products to try to ease any pain that could be caused.
They believed America had been outmaneuvered at the negotiating table. Generations of work and tradition were being wiped out. Not by the sea, not by storms, but by a trade deal they had no control over. The emotional toll was enormous. In coastal Maine towns, lobster isn't just food. It's identity. It's heritage passed down through traps, boats, and buoys. Seeing buyers turn away wasn't just lost income. It felt like the erasure of a way of life. And it only got worse. Once European buyers switched to Canada, they stayed. New supply chains were built. Long-term contracts were signed. Relationships formed. Canadian lobsters became the first choice, not the backup. The U.S. wasn't just losing business in the short term. It was losing the future, but Europe wasn't the end of it. Canada went even further, joining the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP. That deal opened the gates to booming Asian economies like Japan, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Once again, Canadian lobsters sailed in tariff-free, while U.S. lobsters were locked out. In Asia, Lobster isn't just dinner. It's status, celebration, luxury. And with better trade terms, Canadian exporters dominated. Tokyo sushi bars, Vietnamese weddings, Malaysian festivals, all of them began serving Canadian lobster. The U.S. left on the sidelines. By 2021, the scoreboard was brutal. Canada's lobster exports soared to $3.26 billion, nearly 37% of its total seafood exports. The U.S. just $459 million, a fraction. And then came China. As tariffs hit U.S. lobsters harder, Canada stepped in to fill the void. By 2023, Canadian lobsters had claimed the crown in one of the world's most lucrative seafood markets, leaving Maine's boats struggling to stay afloat. What started as an 8% tariff difference had grown into a global lobster empire for Canada, and a crushing loss for American fishermen. But here's the real kicker. This war isn't over. While Canadian lobstermen are celebrating billion-dollar hauls, U.S. fishermen are gearing up for a fight. And the battlefield? It might just be shifting from the docks to the political arena. Because when 80 million pounds of lobsters no longer have a market, you don't just stay quiet, you fight back. Stay tuned. Because in the next phase, we'll uncover how this seafood war spilled into politics, reshaping elections, alliances, and the very identity of America's coastal towns. In one of the largest seafood markets in the world, Canadian lobsters captured a staggering 76% of the live lobster trade. That left the United States with just 25%. For consumers in Beijing and Shanghai, a lobster from Nova Scotia or Prince Edward Island wasn't just dinner. It was luxury, prestige, and power. A lobster on the table wasn't about taste. It was about status. These bright red crustaceans became gifts at business meetings, tokens at festivals, and symbols of wealth. For decades, American lobster had been competitive in China, but now it was slipping into the shadows. Canadian branding campaigns painted their lobster as the gold standard of seafood, fresh, sustainable, and premium. Combined with Ottawa's strategic trade agreements, Canadian exporters had every advantage. They weren't just selling lobster, they were selling reputation. Meanwhile, U.S. lobstermen were locked out, watching contracts go to their northern rivals. And once long-term deals were signed with Canadian suppliers, the door slammed shut. For American families who had relied on lobster for generations, this wasn't just business, it was betrayal. Canadian coastal towns, on the other hand, were booming. Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island saw record sales. Businesses grew. Families thrived. Ottawa's trade strategies had turned what was once a struggling fishery into a global powerhouse. The pride was visible on every dock, every harbor, every community that lived off the sea. But in Maine, the mood was anger and desperation. To many, it wasn't just Canada winning. It was Washington failing. Fishermen blamed U.S. leaders for falling asleep at the wheel, while Canada built global dominance. And soon, politics took center stage. Donald Trump saw the lobster war as an opportunity. He visited Maine often, shaking hands with lobstermen standing on boats and promising to fight back. His message was simple. He would not let Canada steal Maine's pride. It was powerful imagery. Traps, boats, rugged coastlines used to show he stood with hard-working Americans. But speeches and reality rarely matched. Despite fiery words, Europe didn't shift back to U.S. lobster. Canadian deals were locked into law. Restaurants in Paris, Berlin, and Madrid stuck with Canadian lobster. Trump's promises resonated emotionally, but they didn't change trade policy. Still, the symbolism mattered. In Maine politics, supporting lobstermen became essential. No candidate could run for office without backing the lobster industry. The fight wasn't just economic anymore. It was cultural, it was political, it was survival. When Washington couldn't win on trade, it tried something else: environmental regulation. U.S. authorities claimed Canadian fishing gear endangered the North Atlantic right whale, one of the most threatened species on Earth. With fewer than 400 whales remaining, environmental groups pressured Congress to act. Maine politicians jumped on the cause, arguing that protecting whales justified blocking Canadian imports. But Ottawa saw through it. To them, this wasn't about whales, it was about America using environmentalism as a trade weapon. Canada responded strategically, launching eco-certification campaigns and promoting their lobster as sustainable and whale-safe. Fishermen adjusted their practices while government agencies poured millions into branding Canadian lobster as not just the premium choice, but the ethical choice. Once again, Canada turned a challenge into an advantage. By 2025, subsidies became the next battlefield. The U.S. poured $80 million into coastal economies, helping lobstermen modernize gear and survive shrinking margins. For many Maine families, these subsidies were the only reason they stayed afloat. But money couldn't erase the structural disadvantage. Canada had already built its empire. Ottawa and provincial governments answered with their own subsidies and sustainability programs, funneling millions into fishing towns. By mid-2025, over 80% of Atlantic coastal communities had received direct support. Canadian fishermen weren't just surviving. They were preparing for decades of dominance. The lobster war had evolved from tariffs to politics, from whales to subsidies, and yet the scoreboard was undeniable. Canada had won the long game. But here's the question you need to ask yourself. If Canada could build $1 billion empire out of lobsters, what other industries are quietly being reshaped while we're distracted? Because this wasn't really about seafood. It was about strategy, about who plays the long game and who gets left behind. And here's the greedy truth. The winners in this global seafood war weren't just the fishermen. It was the investors, the exporters, the governments that saw the opportunity before anyone else. Imagine if you knew right now which country or industry is about to pull off the next lobster move. You'd be ahead of the curve, cashing in while others are scrambling. That's why you can't miss what's coming next on this channel. The next story might just show you where the next global trade war gold rush is brewing. So if you don't want to be left behind like Maine's lobstermen, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now, drop a like, and turn on the bell. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss the next move in this global chess game.